Long before gondolas became photo props and the canals filled with cameras, Venice was an empire. Powerful, cunning, and utterly unique. It rose from the swamps of the Adriatic like a mirage, built by traders who turned salt and silk into gold. Its ships ruled the seas, its spies shaped kingdoms, and its wealth shimmered brighter than its marble palaces. But beneath the beauty lay a ruthless machine, a city built on ambition, secrecy, and survival. This was Venice before the postcards, before the tourists, when the lagoon still whispered of power. If you love drifting into the forgotten corners of history, a like or subscribe would be incredible. And let me know where you're listening from. It still amazes me seeing people from Venice to Vancouver share the same quiet moment across centuries. All right, tonight, we're setting sail through mist and moonlight into the forgotten empire of Venice before the tourists arrived. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's step back to a time when the floating city ruled the waves.
The story of Venice begins not with a grand design, but with a desperate flight. In the 5th century AD, the mighty Western Roman Empire was crumbling. The prosperous world of northern Italy was being torn apart by barbarian invasions. The most terrifying of these were the Huns, who swept down from the east under their leader Attila, leaving ruin in their wake. As their cities burned, the Roman citizens of the region, the Veneti, had to flee for their lives. They sought refuge in the one place a horse-mounted army could not follow. This was the vast and desolate lagoon on the coast of the Adriatic Sea. It was not a paradise. It was a hostile maze of mudflats, saltwater marshes, and small shifting islands. But it offered one singular virtue: safety. The shallow, confusing waterways were a natural fortress. The first Venetians were refugees. They were fishermen, salt pan workers, and farmers who had lost everything. On these small, muddy islands, they began to build a new kind of settlement. Their new community was based not on the soil of the earth, but on the salt of the sea. But how do you build a city of stone on a foundation of mud? The Venetians developed an ingenious method. They drove thousands of long sharpened wooden piles deep through the soft mud. They pushed them down until they hit a layer of hard-packed clay below. This created a dense underwater forest, a solid and stable foundation. On top of these pilings they would lay thick platforms of timber. Only then could they begin to construct the stone foundations of their houses, churches and palaces. They were quite literally building a city on top of an upside-down forest. This unique and challenging environment forged a new kind of people. Their roads were canals, their wagons were boats. Their lives became oriented entirely towards the sea. This daily struggle with the water taught them pragmatism and resourcefulness. The city that was born from fear was not destined to remain a humble refuge. It was poised to use its unique position to become a power in its own right. As the small settlements of the lagoon grew into a single thriving city, the Venetians faced a new challenge. They were officially part of the distant Byzantine Empire. But in reality, they were independent. They needed a leader to unite them. However, their history was one of fleeing the brutal tyrants and warring lords of the mainland. Their deepest fear was recreating the very system of one-man rule that they had escaped. Their solution to this dilemma was a political masterpiece, a system of government that would ensure their stability for 1,000 years. In the 8th century, they created the office of the Doge. The title came from the Latin word dux, meaning leader. The choice was deliberate. He was to be a leader but not a monarch, a prince but not a king. Critically, he was elected for life by the city's most powerful families. He was not born into the role. The office was a symbol of the state's continuity, but its power was limited from the very beginning. The true power in Venice lay with the wealthy merchant families. Their fortunes were built on maritime trade. Their greatest fear was that an ambitious Doge could seize absolute power. A single ruler could create a hereditary dynasty, disrupting the commercial enterprise of the city for his own personal glory. The entire Venetian political system, therefore, evolved into a complex and ingenious machine designed to prevent this. The government was a republic, but it was not a democracy. It was a rigid merchant oligarchy. The foundation of this system was the Great Council. This was an assembly made up of the members of all the noble families of Venice. The Great Council was the ultimate source of authority. It elected the members of all the other smaller councils that ran the city. The Doge himself became a kind of constitutional monarch, bound by an elaborate oath of office. The checks on his power were almost paranoid in their thoroughness. He could not name his own successor. His sons were forbidden from holding public office during his reign. His official mail had to be opened and read by state censors before he was allowed to see it. He could not even leave the city of Venice without the permission of his own councils. To further protect the state from internal threats, the Venetians created one of history's most famous and feared institutions, the Council of Ten. This was a small, secretive committee that acted as a state security service. It was tasked with rooting out treason and conspiracies. Its agents were everywhere. Citizens were encouraged to anonymously denounce their neighbours by slipping messages into stone letterboxes placed around the city, the infamous Bodion or Lion's Mouths. The Venetian system was a paradox. It was a republic built on a foundation of profound institutionalized mistrust. Yet this complex web of checks and balances was incredibly successful. While the rest of Europe was constantly torn apart by the ambitions of feudal kings, Venice enjoyed a stability that was the envy of the world. This stability allowed it to focus its entire energy on a single passion: the accumulation of wealth and the building of a great maritime empire. For the first few centuries of its existence, Venice was not fully independent. It lived in the long shadow of the greatest power in the Christian world, the Byzantine Empire. This was the Eastern Roman Empire. It ruled from its magnificent and fabulously wealthy capital, Constantinople. Venice was officially a Byzantine duchy. It was a distant and semi-autonomous province, a small part of a vast and ancient empire. This connection shaped the city's early character. Venice was a city of two worlds. It was geographically in the west, but its culture, art and politics all looked to the east. The breathtaking golden mosaics that began to adorn St. Mark's Basilica were created by Byzantine masters, or in the Byzantine style. This deep connection to Constantinople gave the Venetians unique access to the most sophisticated markets and trade routes in the world. The Venetians were shrewd and pragmatic subjects. They used their relationship with the empire to their own advantage. Their growing navy, the best in the region, often served as a mercenary fleet for the Byzantine emperor. The emperor frequently needed help to fight off Norman and Arab threats in the Mediterranean. Venice provided this vital naval support, but it always came at a price. The most important payment came in the year 1082. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komos was desperate for Venetian help against an invasion. In return for the service of their fleet, he issued an imperial decree known as a Golden Bull. This decree granted Venetian merchants staggering trading privileges throughout the Byzantine Empire. They were allowed to trade completely tax-free in most of the empire's major ports, including Constantinople itself. They were even given their own district and docks in the capital. This was a massive economic coup for Venice. It gave them a huge competitive advantage over their rivals like Genoa and Pisa, but it also slowly began to the Byzantine economy. The empire was now deprived of huge amounts of tax revenue. The relationship began to change. The Venetian servants were now becoming richer and more powerful than their Byzantine masters. Over the next century, this imbalance led to growing tension and resentment. The people of Constantinople grew to hate the arrogant and wealthy Venetian merchants who now dominated their city's commerce. This hostility sometimes erupted into violent riots and massacres. The old alliance had curdled into a relationship of deep mutual suspicion and bitter economic rivalry. By the end of the 12th century, the bond was completely broken. Venice was no longer a servant, but a powerful and independent competitor. The Venetians saw the weakening Byzantine Empire as both a commercial threat and an immense opportunity for plunder. They knew the secrets of Constantinople's wealth, and they knew the weaknesses of its defences. This long and complicated history of service, economic domination, and bitter resentment is the crucial backstory for the shocking events that were to come. As Venice grew in power and distanced itself from its old master, the Byzantine Empire, its leaders knew the city needed a new spiritual heart. A great power required a great patron saint, one whose prestige could rival the apostles of Rome and Constantinople. Their current patron was a minor Byzantine figure, a constant reminder of their former subservience. To be truly independent, Venice needed a relic of the highest order, and so they set their sights on the body of St. Mark the Evangelist himself. There was just one problem. The sacred remains of St. Mark were housed in a shrine in Alexandria, Egypt, a city then under the control of the Muslim Caliphate. In the year 828 AD, two Venetian merchants, Boro da Malamocco and Rustico de Torello, embarked on an audacious and sacrilegious mission. Their goal was a holy theft, an act of pious larceny to bring the evangelist home to their city. The two merchants sailed to Alexandria. Through a combination of bribery and persuasion, they convinced the keepers of the shrine to let them take the saint's body. They claimed they were saving the holy relic from potential desecration by the local rulers, giving their heist a veneer of religious duty. Their greatest challenge, however, was smuggling the body past the Caif's customs officials at the port. It was here that the merchants displayed the cunning and pragmatism that would come to define their republic. They placed the saint's body in a large basket and covered it with layers of pork and cabbage leaves. As the story is told, when the Muslim officials, who consider pork to be unclean, came to inspect the cargo, they recoiled in disgust. They waved the ship through without a proper search. The daring plan had worked perfectly. The arrival of St. Mark's body in Venice was a moment of profound transformation. The entire city erupted in celebration. No longer a cultural province of Byzantium, Venice was now a major pilgrimage destination. Its sacred authority could rival that of Rome itself. The magnificent golden St. Mark's Basilica was commissioned to be the new permanent home for the evangelist's remains, becoming the spiritual and political heart of the Venetian state. With their new patron saints came a new powerful symbol. The traditional icon for St. Mark the Evangelist is a winged lion. Venice immediately adopted this as its own. The Lion of St. Mark, often depicted holding a book, became the official symbol of the Republic. It was stamped on coins, flown on the banners of their warships, and carved into the gates of every city they conquered. The theft of a saint's body was the ultimate declaration of Venetian ambition. It was a sacred act of Lassars that severed their old ties and laid the divine foundation for the independent empire to come. Venice now had a stable government and a divine protector. It also possessed a growing naval power, a fleet strong enough to be hired as mercenaries by the Byzantine emperor himself. But what was the source of this incredible maritime might? The answer, the true physical heart of the Republic, was forged in a single, vast and highly secret location. Tucked away in the eastern corner of the city, behind high red brick walls and guarded towers, lay the Venetian arsenal. It was not merely a shipyard, it was the largest and most efficient industrial complex in Europe. Centuries ahead of its time, the genius of the arsenal was its revolutionary approach to production. In an age where ships were typically built one at a time, the Venetians pioneered the principles of the modern assembly line. The process began with the mass production of standardized, interchangeable parts. Within the arsenal's sprawling complex, dedicated workshops were filled with highly skilled workers known as the arsenalotti. They did nothing but produce identical components: oars, rudders, masts, and vast quantities of rope. These parts were then stored by the thousands in massive warehouses, ready for use at a moment's notice. The assembly of a ship took place along a production canal that flowed through the heart of the complex. A bare pre-built hull would be towed into the canal at one end. As it moved down the waterway, it would stop at a series of stations. At each stop, a different guild of specialized arsenal would swarm the vessel. They fitted it with the specific parts they had mastered. One team would install the rowers' benches. Another would step the mast and rig the sails. In the final stages, the ship would be armed first with crossbows and later with the powerful new technology of cannons cast in the arsenal's own foundries. This system was so astonishingly efficient that it was said a visiting dignitary in a famous demonstration witnessed a new war galley being fully assembled and armed in the time it took him to eat a leisurely dinner. At the peak of its power, Venice could outfit and launch a fully equipped warship in a single day. This incredible speed gave the Republic a strategic advantage that no rival could match. In times of war, they could generate a massive fleet almost instantly, stunning their enemies with the sheer scale and speed of their mobilization. The arsenalotti who worked here were an elite and privileged class. There were state employees with guaranteed lifelong jobs, pensions, and even housing for their families. In return for this security, they were fiercely loyal and sworn to secrecy. They were the guardians of the state's most vital military and industrial secrets. The arsenal was a fortress, not just against enemy fleets, but against the prying eyes of rival powers desperate to steal the secrets of Venice's industrial might. The arsenal was far more than a shipyard. It was the physical manifestation of Venetian ingenuity and pragmatism. It was the factory that allowed a small city built on mud and salt water to project immense naval force across the Mediterranean. The political stability of the Doge's palace provided the will, but the industrial might of the arsenal provided the weapon. The power forged in the dark halls of the arsenal was put on magnificent display for the entire world to see. This happened on one special day each year, the Feast of the Ascension. On this day, the city celebrated its most important and unique state ceremony. It was a ritual that perfectly captured the soul of the Republic. It was called the Marriage to the Sea. The centerpiece of the festival was the Dew's state barge, the Busta. This was no war galley. It was a floating palace, a breathtaking masterpiece of Venetian craftsmanship. The ship was immense, a double-decked vessel propelled by the arsenal's most skilled oarsmen. Its entire surface was covered in elaborate mythical carvings, all heavily gilded with pure gold leaf. When the Buster was brought out of its special shelter, it was said to look like a golden mountain floating on the water. On the morning of the festival, the Doge would board the Busto. He was dressed in his finest ceremonial robes along with the highest officials and foreign ambassadors. From there, he led a grand procession of hundreds of boats out into the lagoon. It was a spectacle of incredible pomp and civic pride. The entire city would turn out to watch the golden barge, followed by a flotilla of brightly decorated gondolas and private yachts. The air filled with music, the pealing of church bells, and the cheers of the Venetian people. The procession's destination was the Leo Inlet. This was the point where the calm waters of the lagoon meet the open expanse of the Adriatic Sea. Here the flotilla would fall silent, and the Doge would perform the ancient and sacred ritual. He would take a consecrated golden ring. He held it aloft for all to see. Then he would recite the solemn, unchangeable Latin vow, Desponsis tar in signum ver perpetu, which means we marry you. Our sea is a sign of true and perpetual dominion. With those words, he would drop the golden ring into the waves. The act was a yearly renewal of the sacred contract at the heart of the city's existence. It was a prayer for the safety of their sailors and the prosperity of their trade, but it was also a powerful statement of political reality. It declared to the world that the Adriatic was Venice's territory. It announced that the sea was their private highway, and that they were its undisputed master. For the Venetians, this was no mere metaphor. Their city was born from the water, protected by the water, and made rich by the water. The sea was their farm, their fortress, and their entire reason for being to be married to the sea was to state the fundamental truth of their world. This magnificent ceremony was the ultimate expression of the Venetian soul. It was a golden spectacle that proclaimed the source of all their power and glory. At the dawn of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III declared the Fourth Crusade, a new holy war to sail to the Holy Land and reclaim Jerusalem. The feudal lords of France and the Holy Roman Empire answered the call. They assembled a magnificent army of knights and soldiers, but to strike at the heart of Muslim power in Egypt, they needed a fleet. There was only one city in the world that could provide it: Venice. The leader of Venice at this time was one of the most remarkable figures of the Middle Ages. His name was Doge Enrico Dandelo. He was an old man, well into his 90s, and he was blind. Yet his mind was as sharp as any man half his age, and his ambition for the glory of Venice was boundless. The Crusader envoys arrived and made their request. They needed a fleet to transport 33,000 men and 4,500 horses. Dandelo and the Venetians drove a hard bargain. They agreed to suspend all their normal commercial activities for over a year. They would dedicate the entire industrial might of the arsenal to this one massive project. The price for this service was a staggering 85,000 silver marks. The Crusaders agreed, and Venice went to work. In the summer of 1202, the Crusader army arrived at the Leo of Venice. A crisis immediately erupted. The army was far smaller than promised. Thousands of knights had taken different routes or dropped out. As a result, they could only pay a fraction of the enormous agreed-upon price. The situation was a disaster for both sides. A massive armed foreign army was now trapped on an island in the lagoon, unable to fulfill its holy vow, and Venice was on the brink of bankruptcy, its expensive new fleet sitting idle in the harbour. It was in this moment of crisis that the blind Doge Dandolo revealed his cunning genius. He made a proposal to the desperate crusaders. They could, he suggested, pay off the rest of their debt, not in silver, but in service. Their first target, he announced, would not be Egypt. It would be the Christian city of Zara, a trading rival of Venice on the Dalmatian coast. The Crusaders were aghast. They had taken a sacred oath to fight the enemies of Christ. Now they were being asked to attack a fellow Christian city for the commercial benefit of Venice. Many protested this blatant hijacking of their holy mission. Some abandoned the crusade in disgust, but the majority, trapped in debt and desperate, reluctantly agreed. To seal the deal, the aged Enrico Dandolo performed a masterful act of political theatre. During a great mass in St. Mark's Basilica, he declared that he, despite his age and blindness, would personally take the cross and lead the crusade. The great fleet paid for with Venetian silver and Crusader desperation finally set sail. Dandolo's great gamble had paid off. He had successfully diverted the entire Fourth Crusade onto a new unforeseen and controversial path, replacing its sacred purpose with the cold, hard logic of Venetian ambition. And so, in the autumn of 1202, the great Crusader and Venetian fleet appeared before the harbour of Zara. When the people of the city saw the massive armada, they were terrified. They were devout Catholics. They hung crucifixes and banners of the Pope from their city walls. They pleaded with the Crusaders not to attack their fellow Christians. The Pope himself had explicitly forbidden the act. He had threatened the entire army with excommunication, but the leaders of the crusade were trapped by their debt, and the blind Doge Dandolo was relentless. For Venice, this was business. The siege began. After a brief and brutal assault, the city of Zara fell to the Crusader army. The knights and soldiers, having now paid a portion of their debt in service, entered and sacked the city. It was a grim prelude to what was to come. The army wintered in the conquered city. It was during this cold and tense winter that the destiny of the crusade was changed forever. A new player arrived. He was a young, exiled Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos. He made the Crusader leaders a breathtaking offer. He asked them to sail to Constantinople and help him take the throne. In return, he would pay their entire debt to Venice. He would also finance their onward journey to Egypt and submit the Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope. For the French and German knights, this was a tempting justification. They could restore a rightful heir and unite the Church, all while solving their financial crisis. For the Venetians, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, was the wealthiest metropolis in the world. It was also Venice's greatest commercial rival. The chance to place a friendly, indebted emperor on its throne was a prize for which Enrico Dandolo was willing to risk everything. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the immense legendary walls of Constantinople. The citizens of the world's greatest Christian capital were stunned to see a fellow Christian army at their gates. The initial assault was successful. The usurper on the throne fled. The young Prince Alexios was installed as co-emperor, but the triumph was short-lived. the new emperor quickly discovered that the city's treasury was empty. He was unable to pay the vast sums he had promised. Tensions exploded. The Crusader army camped outside the walls felt betrayed. They watched as a popular uprising overthrew their puppet emperor, who was brutally murdered. With no hope of payment, the Crusaders made a fateful decision. They would take their payment by force. In April of 1204, they unleashed a full-scale assault. The Venetian fleet played a crucial role. Their ships acted as floating siege towers, allowing them to storm the sea walls. After a desperate battle, the defences were breached. The Crusader army poured into the wealthiest city in Christendom. What followed was one of the most shameful events in medieval history. It was the Great Sack of Constantinople. For 3 days, the city was subjected to an orgy of looting, destruction, and murder. Palaces and churches were stripped of their priceless holy relics and ancient treasures. The great library was burned. Magnificent bronze statues were torn down and melted for coin. Venice played a shrewd and calculated game in the division of the spoils. The French knights took land, but Venice took the prizes that mattered most for a maritime empire. They looted the famous 4 bronze horses, a future symbol for St. Mark's Basilica. They took control of 3/8 of Constantinople itself, and they claimed a string of strategic ports and islands throughout the Byzantine Empire, including the crucial island of Crete. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. It had instead shattered the ancient Christian Byzantine Empire. It had also enriched Venice beyond its wildest dreams. With the wealth of Constantinople in their vaults, and its most strategic ports under their control, Venice was no longer just a powerful city-state. It was now a true empire, the undisputed master of the eastern Mediterranean. In the chaotic aftermath of the sack of Constantinople, the French and German Crusader lords scrambled to carve out feudal kingdoms for themselves. They claimed vast tracts of land from the fallen Byzantine Empire. The Venetians, however, played a much more calculated and strategic game. They had no interest in governing large rebellious inland populations or managing feudal estates. Their ambition was not for land. It was for the sea itself. From the spoils of the fallen empire, they meticulously crafted a new kind of empire, one perfectly suited to a republic of merchants, the Stowe, the state of the sea. While the other crusaders claimed their share in territory, Venice claimed its share in trade routes. Their strategy was to create a long, unbroken chain of fortified ports and islands that would act as stepping stones. It was a maritime highway stretching all the way from the Venetian lagoon to the Black Sea. It was a string of pearls where each pearl was a strategic harbour, a naval base, and a commercial outpost. This would guarantee the safety and supremacy of Venetian shipping. From the partition of the Byzantine Empire, Venice acquired a series of key locations. They secured the most important ports along the coast of Greece. They took control of the Cyclades Islands in the Aegean, but their greatest prize was the massive and strategically vital island of Crete. Known to the Venetians as the Kingdom of Candia, Crete became their most important overseas colony. Its position allowed them to dominate the shipping lanes of the entire eastern Mediterranean. It served as a crucial naval base and a source of valuable goods for centuries. This was not an empire of settlement. It was a commercial and military machine. Each island and port in the Stuma served a specific purpose. They were safe harbours where Venetian merchant Gs could rest, resupply and shelter from storms and pirates. They were naval stations where squadrons of Venetian warships could be based. This allowed them to police the seal lanes and project power far from home, and they were commercial centres where Venetian merchants would collect local goods to be funneled back to the markets of Venice. Life in these colonies was typically overseen by a Venetian governor. He was a nobleman sent from the city to rule over the local, mostly Greek population. It was often a pragmatic, business-like form of rule. It was more concerned with collecting taxes and ensuring the smooth flow of trade than with changing the local culture. The Sto d'Amar was the ultimate expression of the Venetian worldview. It was an empire designed by merchants for merchants. Every island and every harbour was chosen not for its size but for its strategic and commercial value. This network of naval bases and trading posts was the hardened skeleton that supported their vast commercial body. It allowed them to control the flow of wealth from the east back to the heart of their city with unparalleled efficiency and security. They had built their city on the water, and now they had built their empire on it as well. The Venetian empire of ports and islands was designed to funnel the riches of the east to the west. But one Venetian's journey went far deeper beyond the familiar trade routes to the very source of those riches. His name was Marco Polo, and his story would become the most famous travelogue in history. The adventure began in 1271. Marco, then just a 17-year-old boy, set out from Venice with his father and uncle. They were merchants, and this was an ambitious trading mission. Their journey was not a swift voyage by sea, but a long, arduous trek overland, following the legendary network of paths known as the Silk Road. For 3.5 years they travelled, crossing the mountains of Anatolia, the deserts of Persia, and the towering Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world. Finally, they arrived at their destination, the opulent, almost mythical court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor of China. The Khan was a sophisticated and curious ruler, and he was fascinated by these strange men from a distant land. He took a particular liking to the young Marco Polo. He found him to be intelligent and a keen observer. For the next 17 years, Marco Polo did not just trade. He became an honoured emissary and official in the Khan's vast and powerful empire. He travelled all over China on the Khan's business, seeing wonders that no European had ever witnessed before. He saw cities of immense size, far grander than anything in Europe. He saw the burning of black stone or coal for heat. He saw the use of paper money, a concept completely alien to the West. He witnessed the workings of the efficient Mongol postal system and heard tales of the distant islands of Japan. After 24 years away from home, the Polos finally received the Khan's permission to return. Their journey back was just as perilous, this time by sea through the South China Sea and across the Indian Ocean. When they finally arrived back in Venice in 1295, they were almost unrecognizable, dressed in tattered Mongol clothing. Legend says that at first their own family did not believe it was them to prove their story. They cut open the seams of their rough clothes, and a river of priceless jewels, rubies, sapphires, and diamonds hidden from pirates and bandits poured out onto the table. Marco Polo's incredible adventure had one final ironic twist. A few years after his return, Venice was at war with its great rival Genoa. Marco, now a wealthy man, commanded his own galley in the Venetian fleet at the Battle of Cazola in 1298. The Venetians were crushed, and Marco Polo was captured and thrown into a Genoese prison. It was there in that prison cell that he met a writer of romances named Rustichello d'Isa. To pass the time, Marco Polo dictated the entire story of his incredible journey to his cellmate. The resulting book, The Travels of Marco Polo, became an instant sensation. Though many at the time dismissed it as The Million Lies, a collection of fantastic fables, it was the first detailed and realistic account of the Far East that Europe had ever seen. It would inspire future generations of explorers, including Christopher Columbus himself, and would forever cement the legacy of a Venetian merchant who had journeyed to the end of the world and back. Venice had built an empire, and its merchants, like Marco Polo, had journeyed to the ends of the earth. But the great rivalry with Genoa, their powerful twin, on the other side of Italy, was not yet settled. One final brutal war was needed to decide the true master of the Mediterranean. This was the War of Coda, the last and most desperate struggle between the two lions of the sea. The war began in 1378. In a brilliant and daring move, the Genoese fleet achieved what no enemy had ever done before. They sailed into the Venetian lagoon itself. They smashed through the city's outer defences and captured the strategic port of Chioggia at the southern end of the lagoon. For the first time in its history, Venice was directly threatened. Its own waterways occupied by a hostile fleet. This was the Republic's darkest hour. The enemy was at the very gates of the city. The Genoese fleet established a blockade, cutting Venice off from the sea, its only source of food and wealth. The city began to starve. The Genoese admiral, full of confidence, sent a message to the Venetian Doge. He declared he would not grant peace until he had tamed the line of St. Mark itself, a promise of total conquest. In this moment of desperation, the Venetians mounted one of the most remarkable comebacks in naval history. They rallied every ship and every man they had left. They freed their best admiral, Vetto Pisani, from prison to lead them. He proposed a supremely audacious gamble to blockade the blockaders. Under the cover of night, the Venetian fleet sailed south. They reached the narrow sea channels that led out of the Chioggia lagoon, the only escape route for the Genoese fleet. There they sank old heavy ships filled with stone, completely sealing the exits. The entire Genoese fleet, the victors of a moment ago, was now trapped inside the very harbour they had just conquered. The situation was completely reversed. The siege of Venice became the siege of Chioggia. For 6 grueling months, the Venetians held their position, cutting off all food and supplies to the trapped Genoese sailors. It became a brutal war of attrition. Finally, starving and with no hope of rescue, the once mighty Genoese fleet was forced into a humiliating and total surrender. The victory was absolute. The War of Codia had broken the back of Genoese sea power forever. While Genoa would remain a financial centre, its challenge for maritime supremacy was over. Venice now stood alone, the undisputed master of Mediterranean trade. Having vanquished its greatest rival in a war it had almost lost, the Republic was now truly free to enter its golden age. Venice now stood alone as the master of the Mediterranean. Its victory over Genoa had secured its trade routes. Its empire of ports and islands was a perfectly designed machine. This machine was created for a single purpose: to control the most valuable and profitable trade on Earth. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, true wealth was not just gold, it was spice. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon and nutmeg were commodities of almost unimaginable value. They were preservative for meat, essential ingredients in medicine, and the ultimate status symbol for the rich. Their origins in the far-off spice islands of the East were a complete mystery to most Europeans. This made them seem magical and exotic. A small sack of peppercorns could be worth more than a man's entire lifetime of wages. A pound of nutmeg was often valued more highly than a pound of gold. For centuries, Venice positioned itself as the sole gatekeeper of this incredibly lucrative trade. The journey of the spices was a long and perilous one. They were carried by Arab and Indian sailors across the Indian Ocean. They were then moved by long camel caravans across the deserts of Arabia. They finally arrived at the great Mediterranean ports of Alexandria, in Egypt, and Aleppo in Syria. It was here at the threshold of Europe that the Venetians were waiting through a combination of advantageous diplomatic treaties with the sultans of Egypt, the raw power of their navy, and their network of strategic island colonies. Venice established a virtual monopoly. No other European power could effectively buy spices at their source. The lifeblood of this trade was the great Venetian merchant galley. These massive, primarily sail-powered ships, often travelling in protected convoys, would arrive in Alexandria laden with the goods of Europe like Flemish wool and German iron. They would exchange these for the precious cargo from the east. Then began the triumphant journey home, their holds filled with the fragrant, priceless dust that was the foundation of the Republic's fortune. The arrival of a spice convoy in Venice was a moment of city-wide celebration. The ships would unload their cargo at the bustling markets of the Rialto, the air filled with the exotic scents of the Orient here. Under the watchful eyes of state inspectors, every sack of pepper was weighed, taxed, and sold to the merchant houses of the city. From the warehouses of Venice, the spices were then distributed to the rest of the continent. The immense profits from this monopoly funded the splendour of the city. It paid for the magnificent marble palaces that lined the Grand Canal. It paid for the breathtaking artworks of Titian and Verrocchio. It paid for the powerful war fleets that were built in the arsenal. The city of Venice, a glittering jewel on the water, was a city built on a mountain of spice. Venice was now at the peak of its wealth. Its maritime empire funneled the riches of the East into its coffers. But this success created a new and dangerous vulnerability. For centuries, the Republic's only real threats had come from the sea. This was a challenge they had mastered. Now, a new danger was growing on their very doorstep. Powerful and aggressive states were consolidating on the Italian mainland. The greatest of these was the Duchy of Milan, ruled by the ambitious and expansionist Visconti family. Their goal was to conquer all of northern Italy. The leaders of Venice realized that their lagoon was no longer a perfect defense. A powerful enemy controlling the shore could cut off their vital food supplies. They could also sever the land trade routes that ran from Venice over the Alps into the rest of Europe. The sea had made them rich, but the land could make them starve. This new threat sparked a fierce political debate within the Doge's palace. One faction of nobles, the traditionalists, argued that Venice was a creature of the sea. They warned that getting involved in the treacherous and expensive land wars of Italy would be a disastrous mistake. It would betray the city's true nature. The other faction, the expansionists, argued that they had no choice to remain secure. Venice had to control its own backyard. It needed to forge a deep defensive, a buffer zone on the mainland. After a long struggle, the expansionist party won the debate. In the early 15th century, under the leadership of Doge Francesco Foscari, Venice made a radical shift in its grand strategy. It began a long and costly series of wars to conquer the territory behind it. This was the birth of the Stat Terra, the state of the land. The campaign of conquest was swift and successful at first, through a combination of skillful diplomacy and decisive military action. Venice took control of a series of nearby cities. They captured Padua, then Vicenza, and finally the great city of Verona. This expansion gave them control of the major rivers and the fertile farmlands of the Veneto region. For the first time, Venice had secured its own food supply. This was a monumental change for the Republic. Venice was no longer just a maritime empire, it was now a major Italian land power as well. This new land empire would bring the city great security and new resources, but it would also embroil Venice in a century of brutal, complex and expensive land wars. This was a very different kind of conflict from the naval battles they had mastered, and it would demand a new kind of soldier to fight it.